Bereaved families have accused social media firms of treating them inhumanely as their request to access their children's data, they say, were exactly like trying to contact lost property. A letter to the Prime Minister signed by 5 sets of bereaved parents has described how they were left in automated loops, speaking to online bots and blocked from access to crucial data. And I'm joined on the show by Imran Ahmed, who is CEO of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate and who joins me. Hello, Imran. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So can you explain, first of all, what sort of thing the parents, the bereaved parents in these families wanted to get hold of? What was the kind of data that they wanted to access?
Well, it can be a real mix. It could be content that helps them feel connected to someone who's left, gives them a little bit of succor in a moment of real tragedy and pain. It could be, as in the case of Ian Russell, information about the kinds of content Molly was seeing that actually contributed to her death, as we subsequently only discovered through the coroner's process, where the platforms were actually brought before the courts and forced to provide that information.
Just explain to people what sorts of platforms Molly Russell had been looking at. Just explain to people how old she was and just explain to people what happened. We know we're very familiar with her name. People may be a little less familiar with her story. So when her father was finally able to access her online data, what were the sorts of things that he found?
Well, Molly was a 14-year-old girl. Her father, Ian, subsequently, he discovered that on her computer, she had been accessing content from Instagram, Pinterest, and other platforms in which she had been served up repeatedly content encouraging self-harm and eating disorders. And Molly, of course, took her own life. The coroner found that she'd had such an overwhelming slew of content served up to her that it normalized the idea that it was normal to respond to feelings of negativity with self-harm and even taking your own life. Now, imagine being in that bubble of content. Now, parents have the right to see that at the best of times. But of course, if tragedy does strike, then they really do need to understand what may have contributed to it. Platforms, you can understand why they're so hesitant to provide access to parents. They're scared of what might be found. And it's about time that politicians had the backs of parents. You know, it's hard enough parenting without having a system in which platforms can really just ignore you, even in a moment of the ultimate grief.
So when parents describe being put in this inhumane loop, where they're talking to chatbots, which means not real people, where they're going round and round, there's no one they can speak to, they can't access the information, it's a kind of vortex that they're sucked into at a time of the most terrible, terrible loss that anyone can imagine. The loss of your child, the worst loss. What can be done about this? It's now been highlighted. Obviously, we're talking about it, it's being talked about. But what would we like to see instead of that?
Well, Vanessa, I think what's important is to recognise that the government, His Majesty's government, is pushing forward legislation, the Online Safety Bill, which is world-leading. It is. I live in Washington, D.C. I work speak to legislators in Brussels, all over the world. And the UK's legislation is the envy of the world, because once those powers are in place, it will allow the government to create real costs for the platforms if they fail to enforce their own rules. But what we also need is, in these very specific areas, things like data access if a child dies, those need to be new powers that the government introduces in the House of Lords. While the legislation is still being reviewed, it could introduce its own amendments to give parents that power. And I think that's vital, is that as these cases come up of additional things that we need to deal with, the government should be in listening mode and acting mode now. Because by this time next year, the hope is that parents will never have to face that inhumane loop again.
Explain to me what the social media feed gets out of sending a young girl like Molly Russell an endless feed of information about self-harm and eating disorders. How does the platform itself benefit from this? How does it make money? Because after all, that's what it exists to do. How does it make money from doing that?
It's really difficult for this conversation not to feel like it's almost a sort of a cartoon villain. But we're talking about the same platforms that won't hand over data to bereaved parents. The way that they operate, they are not in the content game. They're not in the social, they're not in networking. They make their money through advertising, and they advertise to people who are addicted to using their platforms. So they're in the addiction game, really. And actually, content like eating disorder content, it creates a desire to see more because, of course, body image stuff, which makes you feel bad about yourself, you are constantly in a loop of comparing yourself to others and others. And they consume more and more content trying to see what others are saying about it. There's also communities of people saying, why don't you restrict your calorie intake to 700 a day, which any parent will know is a lethal amount of calories to be taking a day. And it knows as well, the platform knows that that content is the content that keeps kids on that platform for longest, because where else can you find that content but on that platform itself? So it's creating a captive market. And that is the cynical calculation at the heart of the algorithm, because the algorithms that work in these platforms, that essentially the means by which it sorts through the loads of content that's being created and presents you with an individualized newsfeed, that's called the algorithm. The algorithm's job is simply this: find the content that will keep that person on the platform for longest. And they know that for 13-year-old girls, eating disorder content is really powerful in doing that. Hypercharging the natural sort of sense that we have when we're in those teenage years of comparing yourself to others, and also feeling fearful about whether or not you fit in or are good enough.
But the platform doesn't just want you there for a long time. Doesn't it not want you to engage in purchasing and buying and responding to advertising and shopping? Isn't that the crucial thing? Or do they just want your time and your life? Why do they want it? What's the point of it?
So when you advertise on a social media platform, you pay for the eyeballs, you pay for the number of people that watch your ad. And, you know, there's a metric that they use internally called CPM, cost per 1,000 eyes. And you will pay X dollars for 1,000 eyes on your advert. And so they have only one goal: to keep you scrolling. So, for example, on Twitter, every 7 or so posts, it can give you one ad.
Yeah.
So if it can keep you scrolling for 7 more posts, one more ad. And it's a tiny amount of money per ad, but it builds up. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, Meta, 98% of their revenue comes from advertising. 98%. And Mark Zuckerberg is worth $100 billion. He's younger than I am. So, you know, clearly the business works quite effectively. That's what they're in. But the truth is, it's really about keeping you on the platform for as long as possible. There are even more modern platforms like TikTok, which 2/3 of 14 to 24-year-olds in Britain use today. Most parents won't have used it themselves. On average, those kids are spending 70 minutes a day on that platform. And that's a phenomenon. That's sort of the crack cocaine of social media platforms. It's hyper addictive, and as our research has found, very dangerous too.
And let's move on to the crucial thing here, which seems to me to be, by the time, heaven forbid, you're a bereaved parent, it's pretty much too late, isn't it? So what we really need, isn't it, is parents to be able to access this kind of thing as soon as they're worried, or every 8 weeks or every 6 weeks when their children seem perfectly healthy and absolutely fine. We don't want to wait till it's too late, do we?
Well, we don't. And we think there's 2 aspects to this. First of all, there should be greater control and transparency available for parents. But second, parents also need to engage in dialogues with their kids. So the truth is that a lot of kids do have secondary Instagram accounts, what are called Finsta accounts. They may have a secret YouTube account which they're watching, and they don't want their parents to see what they're watching. And that's why there really needs to be a lack of an open and transparent discussion between parents and children. You know, it's so symmetrical. Children can teach parents what they're seeing, and parents can teach kids why they're seeing it so frequently, whether or not it's normal or healthy, because we know that kids often compulsively consume things that might be harmful to them. And actually, in creating that dialogue, that reciprocity where the kids are teaching the parents what they're seeing, how the platform works, parents can help the kids contextualize that information. And also, when bad things start happening, they might be more aware and might be quicker to intervene.
Every time you use the word addictive, and you've used it several times about these social media platforms, it makes me feel as if you feel as if children should be protected from them, so should parents, so should we all, because we're all subject to the same kind of propensity to being addicted. People talk about falling into the hole of social media. You know, you start looking at your phone, 2 hours later you stick your head up, you're not even sure what you've been looking at, 2 hours of your life has disappeared forever. You know, have you bought something, have you been sold something, have you been sold some kind of idea that you didn't really want to know about? What's been going on with your life? And it keeps happening hourly, daily, much too much. And lots of people say they want, you know, some kind of respite from phone use. You know, they're going to put the phone in a basket and leave it there over the weekend, or not take it on holiday, this kind of thing. People talk about it as if they want to wean themselves off it, while at the same time staring at it gratefully and lapping it up for hours on end. So what's going on with the cycle of addiction and also the cycle of enjoyment? Because obviously people like it or they wouldn't keep doing it.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to remember that social media can have its positive edge. I moved to Washington, D.C. during the pandemic. Social media was how I felt love, support, you know, connection to everyone back home in England.
Yeah.
But it had its dark side during the pandemic. We all remember the slew of disinformation about vaccines, for example, that caused such damage to our public health responses. But leaving that aside, look, I mean, when it comes to whether or not children should be using those platforms, I think first of all, parents should have discussions with their kids. There are, in fact, already politicians moving quite hard in this space. We briefed the Surgeon General of the United States and the White House on our last report, which showed how eating disorder content was proliferating on social media. Shortly afterwards, the Surgeon General said perhaps children should be banned from using those platforms before the age of 13. Now, look, I think it's a very, very, you know, it's a somewhat extreme solution, but you can understand why, because when the evidence is being presented, and there's more and more academic research being done, and research by organizations like mine, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is helping people understand the potential harms to kids, some policymakers are responding by going, we should just ban the damn thing.